હરે કૃષ્ણ જયમીનભાઈ.
હરે કૃષ્ણ, કેમ છો?
કેમ છો? જયમીનભાઈ, આમાં ચેટ નથી આ મીટિંગમાં પાછી.
Yeah, મેં નવું instance create કર્યું.
અચ્છા.
પણ I don't know why. Last time the way we resolved is that if chat disappears, you delete the instance and create a new meeting instance.
અચ્છા.
So I don't know. Every time we have to go through the cycle, but I'll check with the admin.
Ah.
You can interrupt me if you have any questions.
Okay.
I don't know why this keeps on happening. It's
Oh, that's all right.
important, but again,
No, I have a hard stop at 6:30 today, so if I leave, just so that you're aware, that I'd have to
6:40.
6:30. I have a hard stop
6:30,
at
yeah, okay.
6:30. Yeah.
I'll try to end up little earlier so that there's a time for question and
Yeah. No problems. I'm on call this weekend, and I have a call at 6:30. So
okay, sure, no worries.
thank you.
Okay. Hare Krishna, everybody. I see still not many have joined. I think they will all join shortly. I think we can get started. So I believe we completed through the 8th verse last time. So we'll begin from the 9th verse of 2nd chapter, titled Contents of Gita Summarized. So last time we ended at verse number 8, where Arjuna was actually saying that he doesn't find any reason or motivation to fight, even if he was to get the entire sovereignty over the entire earth, or unlimited enjoyment in the heavenly planets, which is worthy of the demigods. So having said that, then we'll continue from the 9th verse, where Sanjaya basically describes what's happening and to Dhritarashtra. Verse number 9. Sanjaya uvacha evam uktva rishikesham gudakeshah parantapah na yotsya iti govindam yuktva tushnim babhuvaha. Translation. Sanjaya said, having spoken thus, Arjuna, the chastiser of enemies, told Krishna, Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. So Sanjaya is describing to Dhritarashtra what is happening on the battlefield. So he's telling Dhritarashtra that Arjuna finally said that, I am not going to fight. But it is interesting the words that Sanjaya uses. And the choice of the words that Sanjaya is using is trying to convey to Dhritarashtra that, don't get excited. Don't be happy that Arjuna is not going to fight, and so and that would be advantageous to his sons, Duryodhana. But why? Why? Because he is specifically using the words. If you look at the Sanskrit of the verse, he's referring Arjuna as Gudakesha. Gudakesha means one who can conquer ignorance. So by referring Arjuna as Gudakesha, Sanjay is trying to say that, well, Arjuna is currently in ignorance, right? He has been overcome by ignorance, but he is known as Gudakesha, meaning that he would soon be able to overcome this ignorance. Right now he is overcome by ignorance, but soon he would be able to overcome ignorance. And once he is able to overcome ignorance, then he will again fight. So how he is conveying that? So somebody will ask, okay, how? Well, he is so much in ignorance. How is it possible that he can overcome the ignorance? Well, because he is saying that, whom did he say that I am not going to fight? He's not saying to anyone else, but to Govinda. Now, Govinda means one who gives pleasure to the senses, right? And he is also referred to here as Rishikesham. He's the master of the senses. So by the use of this word, Sanjaya is indicating to Dhritarashtra that because Krishna is the master of the senses, he would help overcome the ignorance. The ignorance, where does the ignorance reside? The ignorance has taken over the senses and the mind of Arjuna, because mind is also one of the senses, right? So mind is considered the sixth sense. And so though the mind of Arjuna is filled with ignorance, because Krishna is Rishikesha, or the master of the senses, he will help Arjuna overcome the ignorance. And by doing that, he is going to give pleasure to the senses of Arjuna as well, once the ignorance is removed. So there is another meaning, is that until the ignorance is removed, we cannot be in a blissful state. In order to be happy, we have to overcome ignorance. And what would be the outcome? Once the ignorance is removed by Rishikesha, then Gudakesha, Arjuna, will show his form of Parantapaha, or the chastiser of the enemies. So another name of Arjuna is Parantapaha. So Param means supreme, and then Tapaha means Tapa. You see in a lot of Indian languages the word Tapa means heat. That heat could be not just physical heat, but heat of chastisement or heat of punishment. And by that, what it means is that Arjuna is supremely capable of chastising the enemies, and so he will resume his original duty. So that's the import of that Sanjaya is trying to convey to Dhritarashtra without elaborating, but just by referring to Arjuna and Krishna by names which are appropriate in this context. Though he's conveying that Arjuna is not willing to fight, soon that would be overcome. And that's the import of this verse. Yes. I think the purport in essence is saying the same thing. So I think we can move on to verse number 10. So verse number 10. Tam uvacha Rishikesha prahassan iva bharata senayor madhye visidantam idam vachaha. Translation: O descendant of Bharat, at that time Krishna, smiling in the midst of both the armies, spoke the following words to the grief-stricken Arjuna. So now Krishna already spoke a little bit earlier, right? He didn't speak a lot, but he at least begin the conversation. We read that second, I believe it was the second verse, of the second chapter, where Krishna was saying that how come this ignorance has overcome you. That's all Krishna has said so far. So now he will elaborate further. So in this verse, Krishna is essentially saying, he smiles. So Krishna is observing what's going on, and then he will start speaking. So what is the import or the purport of this verse? So talk was going on between intimate friends, Rishikesha and Gudakesha, Krishna and Arjuna. Now both were friends and cousins at the same level, in the sense that they had similar age. But as he saw in 2 verses prior to this, where Arjuna said that I am surrendering unto you. Please instruct me. I don't know what I should be doing. You tell me. And then when he says that, Krishna might take it lightly, that he's just asking in a friendly way. That's why Arjuna then clarifies in that same verse, saying that I'm surrendering to you as a disciple. I'm not approaching you as a friend. I'm inquiring from you as a disciple. And so Krishna was smiling for this reason, because a friend has now chosen to become a disciple. So actually, Krishna is superior to everyone. He's the master of everyone. But that is not the essence of our relationship with Krishna. Though it is a fact, though it is a reality, a factual reality, but the real reality, or even higher than that, is that we have a special relationship with Krishna, either as a friend, as a son, or a lover, and that is the substance of our relationship, and not the fact that he is supreme. I mean, he also does not, in one way, actually, that even becomes a hindrance. As long as we look upon Krishna as supreme, then we cannot look upon him as a friend, as a son, or a lover. So that is good for exchange of rasa and bhav. But here, Arjuna, is though he is a friend and though he is a devotee, he is taking the position of a disciple. Only in that position can one be instructed, right? As long as he continues with his friendly in his friendly attitude, then he would not take his friend seriously, right? But now he has accepted Krishna as his master, and as soon as he did that, Krishna assumed the role of a master, and a master talks with the disciple with gravity. Unless there is gravity, then there cannot be any learning. And so Krishna assumes that role. So he's smiling because Arjuna has chosen to become his disciple. Okay, so it appears that talk between master and disciple was openly exchanged in the presence of both the armies, so that everyone may be benefited. So Bhagavad Gita is not meant for any particular person or society or community. Sometimes people argue that, hey, Krishna spoke Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, so it's only for Arjuna. It's not for us, so we should not bother reading it. There are all sort of different ideas, but here Srila Prabhupada is specifying that, well, he did not speak in private, right? They spoke out in the open. Now, you might say, where they are in the middle of a battlefield, still away from the armies, so not everyone heard it. But here Sanjaya is hearing it, and he's conveying it to Dhritarashtra. And then Vyasdev, he recorded it. Let me see what's. I think I'm getting some messages on WhatsApp. People are not able to join. Let me see. Just a sec. Okay. Yeah. So Vyasdev also recorded in Mahabharata for everyone's benefit. And so it's not a secret. It's not a confidential in that sense. It's available to everyone. Any questions on this? I think this is pretty straightforward. We can move on to the next verse. You see how many participants we have. Somebody had challenge joining it. Just showing it says connecting and the call drops. I hope they are able to join it because I think others are able to join it. Okay, verse number 11. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Asochan Anvasocastam Pragyavadamsha Bhasase Gatasum Agatasumscha Nanusochanti Pandita. Translation: The Supreme Personality of Godhead say, while speaking learned words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament neither for the living nor for the dead. So it's a very important verse. I mean, you can say this is so now, as you can see, we can getting into philosophy, right? So now the first statement, which first philosophical statement Krishna is making right over here. Previously, you only say that how come you're overcome by ignorance. Such a behavior neither leads to fame, nor does it lead to heavenly planets. I think that's what he says in the second verse. But now he's making a philosophical statement. Yeah, so another thing about is that if you look at what Arjuna spoke earlier, it sounded very learned, right? I mean, it seemed like very philosophical, and also it seemed like he's saying it all making sense. But here Krishna is basically chastising him. He says you sound like a learned man, but actually what you're saying is all bogus. In essence, that's what he's saying, because you are mourning for something that is not worthy of grief. Why? Because those who are wise, they lament neither for the living nor for the dead. Now, at face value, this sounds like a very cold kind of statement, in the sense that, well, what do you mean we should not have any empathy for anyone? Because earlier we already talked about, well, Arjuna, one of the reasons why he is eligible to listen Bhagavad Gita, because he had empathy, right? And he was very kind and soft-hearted, so that actually made him eligible. So now, here Krishna is actually rejecting it, and he's saying that those who are wise, they neither lament for the living nor for the dead. So what it means is that one really needs to, Krishna has found out the root cause of his problem, that Arjuna is acting from a bodily conception of life. And so Krishna is making a point that when we identify ourselves with the body, which is subject to birth and death, and which is also subject to happiness and grief, so all these things, they happen naturally in the course of time. And when that happens, we will talk about that in much detail later. But in essence, one have to tolerate this, and so one should not mourn either for those who are living nor the dead, because life and death is that of the body, right? And body which is temporary is not worthy for lamentation. In essence, that's what he's saying. So let's go into the purport and try to understand a little bit more in detail. The point I was trying to make is that a lot of people, they also sound very learned when they're talking, and they might have really great ideas, right? Last time we discussed that verse from Mahabharata, Tarko pratishto shrutayo vibhinna naso rishi yashya matana bhinnam dharmasya tattvam nihitam guhayam mahajanayena gata sapantham. So but by logic, we cannot, somebody might be an expert logic, and he might sound, expert in logic, and the person might sound very learned. Or that individual might be expert in some philosophy. Shrutayo vibhinna. There are so many different worldviews and perspective. Or one might even be an expert thinker or a scientist, and one is not considered a rishi unless that person has an opinion different from others. But none of these ways can be used to establish the truth. One has to follow the Mahajan. And so similarly, Krishna is saying that you sound like a learned man, but your words, they do not establish the absolute truth. The other thing is that the teacher, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada mentioned that Krishna took the position of teacher, and the first thing that he did is chastise the student. So he's indirectly calling him a fool. He did not directly say it. It's not in the verse. But he's saying you're talking like a learned man, but you do not know. You do not know that one who is learned, who is a learned? Learned is one who knows what is a body and what is a soul. That is real learning. And based on that learning or understanding, one does not lament for any stage of the body, neither in the living condition nor in the dead condition. So Srila Prabhupada also often used to say that the duty of the father or the spiritual master is to always find fault with the son or the disciple or their children, right? Or a parent in general. Is that that doesn't mean we are always happy. We are not. That doesn't mean we are always so strict that we do not exchange loving relationship with our children. That's not what it means. But the fact that we might motivate them by giving them encouraging them, yes, good job, you did nice, but that should be something that is it should not become a platitude, meaning for every small thing we just tell them, hey, good job, right? And then it doesn't have any value. I mean, if there's something really worthy achievement, we really appreciate it. At the same time, whenever there is a fault or an opportunity to teach them, we have to tell that, hey, this is this is not right, or there is something lacking, or this is how you can improve. And that could be behavior, that could be learning, even any concept that they are learning, or whatever art or science, whatever they are learning. Unless the parent or the teacher tells them that this is incorrect and this is how you can improve, how is the student or the child going to improve? And so the job of the teacher or the parent is not to be to pat the back all the time, as we say in English, but when there's a need, you chastise the student, right? And that's out of love. It's not out of hatred or anger. So similarly, Krishna, is telling Arjuna, you are a fool actually. You think you are a learned man. He indirectly tells him. So the definition of the learned man is one who knows the difference between body and the soul, right? And in our contemporary world, or even at any point in time, like people have different definitions of who a learned person is. Even in Vedic period, there's a different understanding of a pandita. Somebody who is very learned in scriptures, might be able to recite so many things, but might not have realized knowledge. And so that is a colloquial use of the word pandita. But Chanakya Pandit, who is himself a pandit, he says that he has another definition of pandit. What is it? Matravat paradareshu paradravyeshu lostravat atmavat sarvabhutesu yah pashyati sah panditah. Matravat paradareshu, one who considers all women except one's wife as one's mother, right? That is first characteristics. Matravat paradraveshu lostravat. Any wealth of others he considers as a lump of stone, and then he treats everyone as he would like himself to be treated, or with equality. Such a person is a pandita. So that's one definition of pandita. So how is it that that individual is able to treat everyone equally? Because he knows that, well, everyone in essence is a soul, is not a body. That person is a pandit. That person is a learned, and not the other kind of learnings, right? Like in American English or English in general, the word guru has been assimilated. Just like English, it takes words from all the languages of the world, and that's how the number of words in English language, they keep on increasing. And so when they use the word guru, they don't use it in the sense that we understand. Guru literally means someone who is heavy in knowledge and discipline, right? Because they themselves follow strict regiment and discipline, and they They require this discipline in their disciple. That's why the word disciple comes from the word discipline. So Guru is heavy in that sense, and is grave. Like here it says that Krishna, he assumed gravity, right? We just read that he assumed the role of a teacher in gravity. So Guru comes, probably the Latin grav comes from Guru, it's heavy or grave. Yeah. So learned means one who can distinguish between what is body and what is soul, and that distinction, it's not easy. So that is the real distinction. There are people who are learned in distinguishing so many things, like they can go, I just give one example. You go electronics, and then you can go to Costco, and there are so many different the latest models of television out there, and I don't know what they have now, like of course the width of how big the screens are, but also like pixel, what the resolution is, 4K, 8K resolution, and you can, one who is expert can really tell the difference between, or even if you're, have some sense, you can tell like, hey, this is 4K and this is 6K resolution and much more clarity here. The sharpness is very nice, or so it requires, if unless one is trained, you really cannot tell those subtle differences. To the layman, they might appear like they're all same, but no, there is a difference. So that also requires some learning, but that's not the kind of learning that Bhagavad Gita is talking about. That person who can make subtle distinctions in matter, for instance, is not a learned man. A learned man is one who can make the distinction between matter and spirit. Not within matter, there are different gradations, and that's also learning, and it's there in the Vedic scriptures also. In the Sankhya philosophy, there is a detailed descriptions of the 24 elements of matter. Right? There are 5 gross elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. There are 5 working senses. There are 5 knowledge acquiring senses. There are 5 sense objects. So that's 25, right? 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5, that's 20. And then there is mind, intelligence, and contaminated consciousness, which is another 3, and then there is false ego, there's 24. So there's much more detailed description. So all of this, it requires us, distinction between very subtle kind of matter, which even science does not recognize it, right? You just talk about consciousness, but then there is a material consciousness and there is spiritual consciousness. And the material consciousness is not monolithic. The psyche is consisting of 3 parts, which is mind, intelligence, and chitta. So which is contaminated consciousness. So that's why you call man, buddhi, and chit. These are 3 different further divisions of the subconsciousness. So even to understand all that, one requires to be quite learned. But that kind of learning is also not described over here. He says even if someone knows that but does not know the distinction between matter and spirit, then that person is not a learner. So that's the sum and substance of what Srila Prabhupada is explaining over here. So knowledge means to know matter and spirit, and not only that, the controller of the both. So, right, so even higher understanding of what really knowledge is. Okay, you understand what is matter and spirit, but then who is the controller of both matter and spirit? Later in Bhagavad Gita, we'll learn that Krishna is explaining that both of them are my energy. So matter is inferior energy, and then spirit, souls are superior energy. But as soon as you talk about energy, then there should be a reference to the energetic. Right? We give the example when you talk about any object which has, potential energy or kinetic energy, right? So potential energy comes from the altitude, kinetic energy comes from motion. But then energy does not exist in vacuum. The energy is within the object, right? So the object is energetic and it possesses different forms of energy. Similarly, if matter and spirit are inferior and superior energy respectively, that means that there should be someone who is energetic. And who is that energetic? That's Krishna. And so that is real knowledge. So Arjuna actually was making arguments like a learned man, that yet, hey, more important than politics and sociology is principles of morality or religion, dharma. And that's why I'm saying, according to moral principles, I should not attack, I should not even, insult or talk offensively to my guru and my grandfather. What to speak about showering them with, weapons or fighting with them. So he says that moral principle should be higher than any kind of social consideration of, you're saying, if you talk about dharma as a kshatriya, or, he did not say explicitly, but that's what he meant, that, well, as a kshatriya, maybe you're saying I am supposed to fight, but, that's just a social consideration. So he does not understand the, real import of varnashram or varna dharma, which Krishna will explain later in Bhagavad Gita. So he's just considering his the divisions, social divisions, as in a very mundane way, and so considering that mundane understanding of the varnas, he is saying that, well, the morality should be higher, right? But here Prabhupada is saying that, well, even if that was true, so, he's not accepting that, that's a necessarily true statement, but even if it was true, well, even higher than morality is what? The knowledge of matter and the soul and the supreme. It's more important than the religious formularies. And because Arjuna did not have that understanding of distinction between matter and soul, he was acting on a bodily conception, and based on that bodily conception, he was saying, well, this person, is I am this body, and then this body is related to other bodies in an extension of family, which is identifying himself as a descendant of the Kurus. So he was acting on that platform, and because he was not lacking in that knowledge, he should not have posed himself as a learned man. That's what this Krishna is saying. You don't have the foundational understanding, and so you should not be posing as a learned man as you are doing right now. As he did not happen to be very learned man, he was consequently lamenting for something which is not worthy of lamentation. Right? Sochati iti sudra. Sochati is lamentation. This body is born and is destined to be vanquished today or tomorrow, and therefore body is not as important as the soul. One who knows this is actually learned, and for him there is no cause of lamentation regardless of the condition of the material body. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't care about the body, or that there should be unnecessary violence towards the body, because body is an important vehicle by which the soul can achieve spiritual perfection, right? That's why when the soul is deprived of the body, then they turn into ghostly spirits, and that's not a pleasing situation to be, because there's still desires. The subtle body is there, which is mind, intelligence, ego. But then, because the gross body is not there in ghostly beings, they don't have any means to satisfy those desires, and so it's very, it's a condition of suffering. So body is an important vehicle. So this does not mean, sometimes people, misquote Bhagavad Gita to encourage unnecessarily. I mean, there is no widespread practice of that necessarily, where Bhagavad Gita is being misused in that fashion, but is many times misquoted or is misunderstood, or there is a potential that somebody might do that while saying, okay, well, what is not important, then maybe, does it mean we should unnecessarily kill it? No. So again, this war did not happen overnight, right? They tried every single means to stop the war, in the sense, or not the war, to avoid the war, right? Pandavas just asked, like, give us 5 villages, we are Kshatriyas, our dharma is to rule, and we don't aspire to have a big kingdom, we just want something like a small village. But then that was also not given. And then Krishna personally went as a messenger of peace, and that didn't work out. So then, this was the last resort. So it was not done lightly. So that is the sum and substance of this purport. Anyone has any questions so far? The chat option is not working, so you can feel free to interrupt me at any point in time or post a message on WhatsApp. Okay, verse number 12. Natva evaham jatu nasam natvam neme janadipa nacheva navavishyama sarve vayam ataha param. Translation: never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. Okay, so Krishna is further elaborating. He's explaining Arjuna why he called him a fool, right? He did not say directly, but the import was that, and so he's explaining that you're lamenting for all these people. Well, one who is learned should not lament neither for the living nor the dead. Why? Somebody might ask question. Okay, you're saying I should not lament neither for the living nor the dead. Why? Because he's saying, well, what you consider as living or dead applies only to the body. If you talk about the actual individuals, they always exist. You see, there was never a time when I was not present. There was never a time where you were not present. There was never a time where all these kings were not that they were not present. Nor in future shall any of us cease to exist. This is making a very important point over here. That in any point in time, our individual existence always sustains, right? So I was just mentioning about ghostly beings. So even temporarily, somebody might not have a gross body, and they are existing in the forms of ghostly beings who just have a subtle body, but they still exist. They have an individuality. In the due course of time, they would again get a gross body by the arrangement of nature in any of the different species of life, and in the new body, the existence will continue to be. One does not lose the existence, and that applies to the past, applies to the present, applies to the future. And even in a liberated state of life, even when one realizes one's spiritual identity, so as soon as we say spiritual identity, means there is an individual existence. If one loses their existence, then there is no identity, right? So even when a chi becomes spiritually realized, or even when he goes to the spiritual world, they continue to maintain their individual identity, right? Actually, so it's a superfluous term. As soon as you say identity, means that person is individual. If one loses the individuality, then there is no identity, right? So here in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is making many important points. So first of all, we see that in the Vedas, in the Katha Upanishad, as well as in Svetasvatara Upanishad, it is said that Supreme Personality of Godhead is the maintainer of innumerable living entities in terms of different situations according to individual work and reaction of the work. That Supreme Personality of Godhead is also by his plenary portions alive in the heart of every living entity. Only saintly persons who can see within and without the same Supreme Lord can actually attain perfect and eternal peace. So this is the verse from Katha Upanishad, that the Supreme Personality of Godhead and all his plenary portions, meaning his different expansions, I think specifically by his plenary portions alive in the hearts of every living entity. Okay, so here it's referring to the Paramatma. So Lord is personally present as Swayam Bhagavan, but then he's also present in the heart of every living entity as Paramatma. And those who are saintly beings, they can see him within as Paramatma and without as the Supreme Lord. And those individuals, they can attain the perfect eternal peace. So first of all, one needs to understand that one is self, in the sense one is spirit and one is not the body. And then beyond that, there is a higher understanding. Okay, I am spirit, but then there is Supreme Spirit. And the Supreme Spirit exists as Paramatma with me at all times, and also exists without as the personality of Godhead. So the same Vedic truth given to Arjuna is given to all the persons of the world who pose themselves very learned. So sometimes we see that individuals are proud of their knowledge. And Srila Prabhupada is making the point is that, despite of whatever material knowledge one might have, that is in eventuality is all waste. because all your material knowledge will be finished as the body is finished. But when one achieves the knowledge of spirit, one realizes one's identity, then that is real knowledge or the real truth. And so this is available to all persons, and especially those who are under the impression that they have achieved the epitome of all knowledge, then they should understand that the knowledge of the spirit is even higher than that. So Srila Prabhupada often gives the example when he first visited Russia. I think he visited only once, and he was still a communist country at the time, in the 70s, and it was very strict. And somehow, anyway, there was a meeting arranged with a particular a scientist or a philosopher in the University of Moscow. I believe his name was Dr. Tartovsky. And then you were having a philosophical conversation, and then he was a scientist of repute. He was very learned in his own right, and Srila Prabhupada used to say that such a learned man, he knows so many doctorate degrees, or it poses as a very learned man, but the conversation is recorded. I'll try to find and share it with you. But he at one point he says that what, Prabhupada, when the body dies, everything is finished. And then Srila Prabhupada later comments that despite of having so much knowledge, the knowledge of spirit, we see that it's not there, even among people who pose themselves as very learned. And then in the same line of thought, he comments, not directly to Dr. Tartovsky, but in a later conversation, he says, but if you go to India, those who are brought up in Vedic culture, even an illiterate farmer who is working in the farm, he knows, at least theoretically, they have heard from, their parents, forefathers, that they are not the body. There is a spirit, and once the body is over, because of my karma, I am in this particular socio-economic situation, or whether it could be good, materially good or materially not so good, and that will pass away. And eventually, when the body dies, and based on my karma, I'll get another body. That's common knowledge. But from an external perspective, that person is just an illiterate farmer, right? But they know the essence of all the truth. I see there's a question, a hand raised, Suma.
Yes, Prabhuji. Now, this kind of contradicting for me, because in the earlier verses, Krishna motivates Arjuna to go ahead and wage a war with Kauravas, because those people, the Kauravas, did all the 5 ill doings, like
Yes,
kidnapping the wife, trying to poison, and so on, right?
aggressors, 6 kind of aggressors.
6 kind of aggressions. Thank you. So that being said, at that context, Krishna is in a way influencing Arjuna to think that they are humans and they have done all these kind of aggressions, and he should wage a war with them. And in the current context, what we are speaking about here, Krishna is saying it's the soul. He's referring to Arjuna as like Arjuna is not learned enough to realize that it's not humans, but it's the soul that he should look at, right? Then if it's the same soul in the earlier context, then why wage a war and do all this? Why is it's addressed differently, human versus soul in different contexts here? It should have been the same soul that you see there as well, right? When he wanted to wage a war with Kauravas.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Thank you for bringing that up. So our original identity is that of spirit. That is a fact, right? There's no doubt about it. But we are conditioned in the sense that we are not acting on a spiritual platform. We are not established in our true identity, and that's why we have different kind of bodies based on our different karma, and then we are responsible for our actions, right? When we are acting according to our identity, original spiritual identity, then there is no question of good karma or bad karma. We transcend both good karma and bad karma, and there is no We are not subject to the reactions. But when we are acting according to our material nature, our conditioning, which is not our true identity, then those actions are subject to good or bad. The spirit, there is no good or bad. The goodness, the good and the evil is a mundane conception, right? That mundane conception applies as long as our mundane existence continues. Now, even in this mundane world, when somebody has realized their spiritual nature, then those mundane moralities don't apply to them. So I'll give an example. Srila Prabhupada says many times that someone, say there is a war that's going on, right? So like right now, India and China, it's not an active war, but it's a very tense situation. So on the order of a military commander, somebody shoots the enemies, and that person kills so many different individuals, then that person is not subject to any punishment, right? He's only acting according to the orders of that individual. And many times the other party might also appreciate. There are many times sometimes what happens, I'll give an example. It happens in across all countries. It was, I can't remember if the war was war of the 70s, 1975 maybe, or the 72 when India-Pakistan war was fought, or in the 90s. There was a Pakistani military general, and then he fought with Indians, and then he fought very valiantly, and then he killed so many Indian soldiers. To the extent that he was amputated, he lost his limb and leg, but he was so much valor, he was still fighting, and that was very impressive. And then I think after that military engagement of fighting was over. I think that he died eventually, but his valor was recognized, and even the Indian commanders, they commended his valor, and they sent an appreciation letter to him. So the point being is that when one is fighting according to the instructions of their authority, then there is no question of right or wrong for that individual. He is just doing his duty. Now the same individual as a civilian goes back to his home, and they say, okay, he takes out his weapons, goes out in the public and shoots 10 people. Then that same individual now is acting not on the basis of any authorities, acting out of one's own whims, and then that person is subject to punishment, because now it's considered as a crime. So similarly, when we are acting according to being situated in the spiritual nature, later Krishna says to Arjuna that one who is perfectly situated in spiritual consciousness, and when one is acting, then there is no karma. Even if he is killing millions of people, he is not accruing sin. I mean, not that somebody, because such person would not whimsically kill anyway. He's giving that as an it might sound like an exaggeration. He doesn't use the word million, but I think he says is that even if such a person kills, right, he's not acting out of anger or envy, or there must be some reason for that person, because that person is situated in its perfect spiritual identity. So now coming to the example that specifically talked about the 6 aggressors, Duryodhana and Kauravas, they were definitely evil-minded. There was no reason for them. I mean, those 6 aggressions, they are all were uninvited for, and they were not according to the principles of dharma. So they, and especially they being Kshatriyas, the Kshatriyas are supposed to protect dharma, right? If they are, doing injustice to their own cousins, to other Kshatriyas who are very powerful, what is the chance that they would rule the subjects in a just manner? And unless the Kshatriyas establish the law and order, the other Varnas cannot live peacefully, especially the Brahmanas. They are not protected. The Vaishyas, the Sudras, And so this Varnas, when they exist in their natural order, the Varna system, as we learn later, is basically for gradual spiritual upliftment of the people. And Krishna says, I established this Varnashram so that people can achieve spiritual progress, right? So that's why, and for that purpose, sometimes violence is needed. And so this violence, Kshatriya, Shat means one who does harm, and Traya means to protect. So Kshatriyas are ones who protects the subjects from harm. So as a Kshatriya, it was appropriate for Pandavas to chastise Kauravas because of their aggressions. So there is nothing wrong, because now see, they're all acting on a bodily consciousness, in the sense that the Varnashram is again for people who are not fully spiritually realized. So there is no, we cannot consider that, oh, they are spirit souls and so we should not attack them, right? Like a tiger, you can go and hug a cow, but if there is a tiger, you say, oh, tiger is also a spirit soul. So if you go and hug a tiger, the tiger is not gonna say, oh, my friend, come over here, I'm so happy you, but you know, it's according to nature, it will attack you. Now, why here why does it matter? Here Arjuna is not, what is the criteria based on which Arjuna is saying, I don't want to fight, right? He doesn't have a good reason. He's not asking, he's just saying this out of his attachment from a bodily conception of life. So what he's saying is that, oh, this is my grandfather, this is my teacher, right?
So yeah, so he sees them as humans, as human individuals, right? But Krishna is now directing him to see them as, I mean, see things like soul and not just as humans.
Right.
So
because
that concept
there is no principle of dharma that is being applied, right? So when there was a violation of the 6 aggressions that happened, right, there is a violation of the moral code of dharma, right? Here Arjuna is trying to come up with reasons why he should not fight, right? But the main reason why he really does not want to fight, because he's saying, oh, maybe because in one place he says that, oh, even if they are motivated by ill reasons, that means, you know, they have some material reasons why they are supporting the son of Dhritarashtra, the evil-minded. So, you know, they have other motivations to be able to do that. But even if it is true, because he is my guru, because he is my grandfather, then I won't chastise him, because if they are dead, or, you know, when they would die, even if I win, I won't be able to enjoy. So this is like saying that the president or the, you know, the judge, or you say, well, you know, I have to do my duty, but you know, in this case, if I do my duty, my son or my uncle or my cousin, you know, I have to imprison him. You know, I don't want to do that. You know, what's the point in doing my duty if you know, I have to imprison my own family members, and I won't, even if I get a medal, oh, you did a, you know, such a great job that you were you know, you did not give up your duty, and you know, I would get so much honor and recognition for doing this, but because I you know, arrested my own family member, then you know, that won't make me happy. That is the kind of argument you know, Arjuna is making. So now you can instruct on multiple levels. So Krishna actually will instruct Arjuna at multiple levels. He will instruct him at the level of you know, at a matter, at the level of you know, mental conditioning, at an intellectual level. He will give a lot of different reasons. Like first thing he says, even before making this argument, what is Krishna telling to Arjuna? He's saying that, well, you know, you will get infamy. You know, if you do this, people will say that, you know, you know, you are a coward, you ran away, right? So that is a material conditioning. Just like a child, we sometimes, ideally, we want the child to be self-motivated to do something, right? Okay, you should do your homework, right? But sometimes we say that we give him some, you know, material motivation. Oh, if you know, if you get this, you know, this good, you know, good grades, then, you know, I'll get this thing for you. I'll get you this particular gift. I'll get your favorite bike or something like that. There are different ways of motivating. So in that sense, Krishna first of all says that, you know, you will get infamy. So that is a material consideration, right? It's true. It's not on a spiritual level, because later Krishna will say that, you know, you should not be worried about you know, fame and infamy. That is acting on a spiritual level. But before that, Krishna is trying to, he's trying different levers to motivate Arjuna to come back to his senses. And then if that doesn't work, then ultimately tells the ultimate spiritual truth. So in this particular case, Arjuna is not, the primary reason, the root cause of Arjuna's ignorance was that he was not realizing the spiritual truth, right? That we are not this body, we are the spirit soul. And because of his bodily understanding, he was saying, this is my grandfather, this is my teacher, and even if they did something wrong, I should not punish them. So that is acting against the code of dharma, right? Over there, if you as long as we are in the material world, we have to act according to the codes of dharma, unless we become spiritually realized, right? So if Arjuna is making arguments to act against the code of dharma, that said, I won't do my duty because those are my family members, but that is a material understanding. So then if you're lamenting for the death of your family member, well, Krishna says, okay, that one way you can convince someone is that, well, you need to understand that you're not, you're saying this person will die, and that will make me unhappy, or he's just unhappy that this person is gone forever. But Krishna is saying that he is not gone forever. That's not a good reason for you to not do your dharma, because you're thinking that this person won't exist, and because he won't exist in the course of execution of my duty, I don't want to do my duty. So if this is your premise, that this person would be dead, right? Then that's a false premise. That's what Krishna is trying to say. Now, if you attack an aggressor, that person is also going to be dead. But Arjuna was not lamenting for them, right? He is not lamenting. I mean, in one way, he's lamenting, okay, I don't even want Duryodhan to die. But that was an extension of his lamentation. But that was not his real lamentation. His real lamentation was Dronacharya and Bhishma. And then, and as an extension, he was saying, okay, I don't care even if Duryodhan kills me, right? But if that was really the case, he would not even come over there to fight, right? So he has chastised so many aggressors in the past. It's not the first time Arjuna is chastising anyone. So he has done that in the past. As long as we are materially conditioned, we act on a material level in our day-to-day duties. We cannot artificially try. If it naturally comes, that's okay. We cannot artificially say that, oh, he is spirit, I am spirit, we are all spirit. So we cannot artificially try to act in that fashion. Right. But just to remove Arjuna's lamentation, right? Krishna is telling that ultimate spiritual truth, that your premise is that this person will cease to exist, and that's why I don't want to fight. So your premise is wrong. That's all Krishna is trying to say.
Right. Okay. Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay. So Lord says clearly that he himself, Arjuna, and all kings who are assembled on the battlefield are eternally individual beings. And the Lord is eternally maintainer of the individual living entities, both in the conditioned and the spirit and their liberated situation. So I mentioned that it's not that once we achieve spiritual perfection, we cease to exist. The idea, especially among the impersonalists, the Mayavadis, they have this idea that, eventually we'll all merge into the Brahman and we'll lose our existence, we'll lose our identity. Even when the soul does merge into Brahman, that's one kind of liberation. The soul still has its identity. We cannot externally perceive it, but the soul does have it. It has its identity. It does not lose. It just becomes one of the particles in that effulgence light of Brahman that is emanating. The Lord's. So what it says? Yeah. So and the kings, everyone, including the kings, they are all individual, eternal persons. It is not that they did not exist as individuals in the past. They will continue to exist in the future. The individuality will always continue. There is no cause of lamentation for anyone. So that's the import of this. Yeah, so the Mayavadi theory we talked about, right? That they lose its individual existence is not supported herein. Okay. Nor is the theory that we only think of individuality in the conditioned state supported herein. So because Krishna is saying not only that when we are conditioned, even when we achieve spiritual perfection, our individuality will continue. This statement of Krishna is very authoritative. Krishna cannot be subject to illusion. If this individuality was not a fact, then Krishna would not have emphasized that, hey, you will exist even in future, not just you and me, but even all the kings, everyone. So somebody can make an argument that, especially according to the impersonal theory, that this individuality between different living beings will only exist as long as we are conditioned. But when we become spiritually perfect, we all merge into the absolute truth and we all lose our identity. So that is not supported herein. So even accepting the argument, how can one distinguish Krishna's individuality? Krishna affirms his individuality in the past and confirms his individuality in the future. Krishna has maintained spiritual individuality all along, and if he is accepted in ordinary conditioned soul in the individual consciousness, then his Bhagavad Gita has no value as authoritative scripture. So what this is saying is that the individual, I just said, right, individuality exists even in the liberated state. Yeah, one does not lose one's individuality. So somebody might say that this well, there are two things. One is that, well, this individuality only applies to conditioned state, but not in the spiritual state. So if that was true, then Krishna would not have said future. Future means all time in future, not that it ends at some certain point. Future means it's for rest of the future. Now somebody, if they say that this was not true, right, that we all lose our identity. With Krishna in this verse, he's saying this applies not just to you and me, it applies to everyone, right? You, kings, and me, everyone. So if we do not accept Krishna's statement that we will lose our identity, right? When we become spiritually perfect, we will lose our identity. If we accept that theory, then that would also apply to Krishna, that Krishna will also lose his identity. If Krishna also loses his identity, right, then his position as the Supreme Personality of Godhead is not valid anymore, right? Because Krishna lost his identity, right? Then he just becomes like us. If we accept that theory, if we accept that in future, in a spiritual perfection, you can think of it as a spiritual suicide, because a lot of people, they are frustrated by relationships, or they can never find perfect happiness, and some people come to the conclusion the root cause of all problems is people, and that's why a lot of spiritual path, they want to go away from people, right? And they don't want to do anything with people. And so the logical extension of that is their idea of spiritual perfection is that, well, when you become spiritually perfect, we cease to exist and our individual existence goes away. And that means we don't have to deal with people. And so that's the ultimate state of happiness. Now, in the statement, Krishna is saying that, we all exist at all times. If somebody can say that, oh, Krishna only meant about material existence, not in the state of spiritual perfection. Now, but if that logic is true, it also applies to Krishna. If it applies to Krishna, that means Krishna will also lose his existence. If Krishna loses his existence, then, and if he merges into some, non-existence, then he is not the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is just an ordinary person like us. Then why waste our time listening to Bhagavad Gita? If it's just some philosophy. There are so many people who speak different things, right? We talked about it. Srutayo vinna naso rishi yasha matana binnam. So if everyone has his own opinion and there are so many nice sounding philosophies, Bhagavad Gita then just becomes an ordinary book. Then why we should waste our time listening to it? So Bhagavad Gita is an authoritative scripture. It's not an ordinary book. A common man with all 4 defects of human frailty is unable to teach that which is worth teaching. Gita is about such literature, and no mundane book can compare with Bhagavad Gita. So there's so many Vedas, and they all come from Krishna, all the Vedic knowledge, but this Bhagavad Gita is directly spoken by Krishna, right? And so you cannot compare any other literature to be on the same level as Bhagavad Gita, because it's spoken by Swayam Bhagavan. It's not that we do not respect, other literature of different religions, but we as you study Bhagavad Gita, you will see that there is a vast ocean of difference in terms of the kind of the knowledge that we find in Bhagavad Gita. So so the 4 defects. What are the 4 defects? I'm not sure if we talked about it, but the 4, I believe we talked in the past, so I'll quickly mention. So the 4 defects are related to the senses, mind, intelligence, and ego. The defect of the senses are imperfect, right? So if I am short-sighted, then without my glasses I cannot see. That is limitation of my senses. My senses are defective. Even if my eyes are perfect, there's only so much resolution that my eyes have. They are not obviously as powerful as a microscope or a telescope. Otherwise we wouldn't need those kind of instruments. So there is a range within which the senses work, and then even then they're not necessarily perfect. Then the mind. So once I see or taste or feel and smell, all has to be processed by the mind. What does mind do? Mind basically assigns category. Okay, this kind of perception of sight, some frequency of light, that is captured by my retina. Then the mind actually assigns that image to the idea of a color, shape, form, and then assigns that a category of an object. Well, this is a TV, or this is a plant, or a tree. That is a function of a mind. Now, this mind can be subject to illusion, and you can go on the internet, you can search and for different kind of optical illusions. And so it's the same image, but that same image is perceived differently by different people, or even the same person might perceive it differently at any given point in time. The image might be stationary, but then you feel like, no, it's moving. There's some pattern that's moving. We all have seen examples. And so sometimes on the road, these example in the scriptures that is given is that a snake appearing as a rope, or a rope appearing as a snake, and they're all different kind of optical illusions. So optical illusion is one kind, it's just talking about a sight, but then there could be illusion on auditory illusion. You might hear a sound which you feel like, well, this sound sounds like this particular thing, but it might actually be something else. Same thing with your taste. Just like if we have this experience, especially when you eat this Indian gooseberry amla, and then you drink water, the water tastes very sweet, but the taste of the water is neutral. But now, because I have eaten amla, then the sense perception is messed up, and so when the mind says, no, this is very sweet, the water is not sweet, right? So what happened? So mind can create illusion, not just optical illusion. There is a illusion of the tactile sense. If you go to the dentist, or if you even like a surgery with a local anesthesia, now hand is numb, and the hand cannot feel it, but then that doesn't mean that's a reality. Well, that object does have a texture, but then we are not able to feel it. Similarly, the taste could be different than what the real truth is, or even what we hear by our ears. The mind can create a different illusion. And then the intelligence can commit mistakes. There is no one in this world who can say that, well, I never committed a mistake, right? No matter how intelligent that person is, or even how expert they are in doing that same routine on a daily basis, like that's why they have accidents. I might have 40 years of driving experience, but I could still make a mistake, and then I could have a severe injury, or somebody can die. Same thing, a factory worker, for instance, or a pilot in an airplane. Anyone can commit mistake, right? It's that's why they say to err is human and to forgive is divine. So the intelligence is always subject to mistake and errors. And then the ego, there is a cheating propensity, and that's another defect. So at the level of ego, beyond intelligence is ego, and this ego is subject to cheating propensity. Well, sometimes you see many examples where individuals, they know the truth, but then say, if I speak the truth, then there is a conflict of interest. Like a lot of research that goes in academia, sometimes we happen that, like there was an archaeologist, she found that fossil remains where the dinosaurs and humans, they existed at the same time. But then if when she brought this out, well, the peers who had made their career, they're like, if we accept this as truth, then all our life of research that we have done, it will be all waste. Our reputation would not exist. So then there is a conflict of interest, and there is a cheating propensity. For my own interest, I won't tell the truth. So these 4 defects, when they are existing, then everyone has these 4 defects, and if anyone compiles a literature, the literature would also have these 4 defects. But Bhagavad Gita is not like that. That's the point Srila Prabhupada is making. Spoken by Krishna is not subject to these 4 defects, and so it has a special position. It's not compiled by ordinary man. There is a question, Kashyap Prabhu.
Prabhu, so when you say that we will be exist, we already exist before and now and we're going to exist future. What is it actually going to exist? Like, is it our mind, intellect, or is it like a conditional self, which is Jivatma? They say that, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, I'm trying to understand what is it exactly exists here. Then I actually have a follow-up question on that.
Okay, so what Krishna is talking about is, well, in essence, the soul always exists. The soul has broadly 2 layers of coverings. One is this covering of a subtle body, and that subtle body comprises of subtle senses, subtle mind, subtle intelligence, and the subtle ego. So you think of subtle senses as it's something that you cannot, anything subtle you cannot perceive by your 5 senses. That means you cannot taste it, touch it, feel it, smell it, see it. So the subtle senses exist. So the subtle body has subtle arms or subtle legs, or all the working senses and all of that things, they exist. You can think of your hand. Let's take an example. This hand is the same hand. This hand can assume, if I'm playing baseball, then I can wear baseball gloves. If I am doing, some sort of work, mechanic work, then I wear a different set of gloves. And then if I'm doing biking, I wear a different set of gloves. Golfing, boxing, then it's a different kind of gloves. But the hand is the same. So the subtle body is always the same, but that subtle body can acquire different kind of gross biological bodies. And the same hand, it perfectly fits into different kind of gloves, and that subtle body similarly perfectly fits into different kind of biological bodies. And those biological bodies, they give the soul or the opportunity to satisfy different kind of desires. Each body is suitable to satisfy a particular kind of desire, and based on our karma, there is a desire and then there is the eligibility. So karma is eligibility and there is a desire, and when both come together, one gets a particular kind of a body. Like if I, in a human body, even if I'm an Olympic champion, I cannot run as fast as a cheetah. If you don't want, but an average cheetah can, beat anyone, like probably run faster than a car, or quite comparably. So different bodies, they are meant for different kind of enjoyments, and so those biological bodies die. In this, they go through the sadvikar, 6 kind of changes. You have the birth, then there is growth, then there is sustenance. They produce byproducts, which is offsprings, and then there is dwindling and death. So there are 6 kind of changes that biological bodies go through. When that biological body dies, the subtle body continues to exist. And the subtle body, which has subtle senses, and also mind, intelligence, and ego. Sometimes people have memories from previous life, the reincarnation. They remember, I was such and such person in this village, this was my name, this is how I died, and then, which might be a very far town, and then somebody goes and does an investigation. Yeah, there used to be a person like this. Yes, this details that you can tell. Sometimes people are able to recall. So the mind or the subconsciousness exists and it continues from one life to another life. The gross body is gone, but the subtle body, which is subtle senses, and the mind, which has all the memories and impressions, intelligence, all that continues. When one achieves spiritual perfection and one goes to the spiritual world, then the subtle body is also given up, which comprises of subtle senses, mind, intelligence, all that goes away, because that is also a subtle covering, but it's still a material covering on the soul. The soul is someone who is covered by these two layers. The soul is the one who is experiencing things. It's kind of a virtual reality, if you will, where the actually the pleasures and sufferings, they are not experienced by the soul. It's actually experienced by the ego. Ego is the first covering on the soul. Ego is part of the subtle body. Subtle body is subtle senses, subtle mind, subtle intelligence, and ego. But because we identify ourselves with the body, we experience happiness and sufferings because we identify with the body. Why do we identify with the body? Because of the false ego. Aham, I'm this, right? Just like I gave the example, if I have my own car and I run into a crash and I lose my car, it's totaled, then I will feel anxiety. I lost my car. Why? Because I identify myself with the car. Now, if I'm going in an Uber and then the car collides, nothing happened to me in both cases. Then what I do, I get out of the car, I call another Uber and keep going, right? Because I don't identify with the car, right? So similarly, the soul has nothing to do with this body, but the soul identifies itself with the body. That's why the soul is conditioned. What is the conditioning? Conditioning is that the false identification with the body. Because of that identification, the soul is enjoying and suffering. Otherwise, the soul has nothing to do with. So as soon as we realize our identity, just like the person who realizes, hey, this is not my car, even if it collided, I can move on, right? So the whole path of spiritual perfection is to realize our own identity. So we are not affected by the ups and downs, and we are not overcome or overwhelmed by it. So that's one level of spiritualness. So when Krishna is saying, well, you always continue to exist, it's not referring to the subtle body, it's referring to the soul, which is covered by the subtle and gross bodies. Does that make sense?
Which is ego in this case.
Soul is not the ego. Soul is covered by the ego. So when Krishna is saying you will always exist, is not saying the ego will exist. He says is the soul. You as a soul will always exist. Now the ego will continue to exist in the material as long as the material existence continues. But here, what is Srila Prabhupada saying? Well, Srila Prabhupada is explaining that Krishna is saying that even when one achieves spiritual perfection, you will continue to exist. So when spiritual perfection, that means one goes to the spiritual world, you will continue to exist. You won't lose your individuality. So in the spiritual world, there is no false ego. So it's actually referring to the soul.
Right. So if I understand correctly, I'll try to restate it. There is a subtle body, and it'll actually have subtle senses and subtle mind, and have ego in it. So when someone achieves the spiritual perfection, they actually leave the subtle body, which actually have all this mind, senses, and everything, including the ego, and there is actually a soul other than this, other than the subtle body. That soul is actually going to take another subtle body or something to be
No, the soul
exist.
actually is complete. It's all spirit, and then the soul actually has its own spiritual form. Soul also has a form. It's not a spark. It's not just like a spark. Actually, it has its own spiritual form, which is fully replete. Just like Krishna is all spirit. So we are also spirit. So that means we also have a form. The actual spirit soul also has a form. And we don't have any direct experience of it, but it has its own spiritual senses and spiritual body. The spirit, it's when you say spirit, it's actually a spiritual form. It's a full spirit form.
So
And
basically, I remember reading this in one of the verses of Bhagavad Gita, like it is a formless and I don't know, it is Bhagavad Gita or somewhere, I don't know. I have heard this before, but It's a formless. It is
Yeah.
so.
Sometimes when they say,
Nirakara,
Nirakara, Niswarupa, it basically means that it doesn't have a material form. It's talking in terms of things that we understand, right? I cannot describe something that of which I don't have experience. What you don't know is what you don't know. So when it's saying it doesn't have a form, it's talking about the form that we understand. It cannot talk about the form of which we don't have an experience. Language is again built based on our experiences. So we don't have any experience of that spirit forms. It's not talking about that. So when it says it doesn't have a form, it's talking about the form that we know, which is the material form. So it says it doesn't have a material form. That's what it literally means.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so yeah, no mundane book can compare with Bhagavad Gita. When one accepts Krishna as an ordinary man, then Gita loses all the importance. So now the Mayavadis, they might argue that the plurality which is mentioned in this verse is actually referring to the body. So plurality here is referring to the fact of different bodies. That's what it means. It's when we try to, I think there are a couple of words. I think in terms of elections, I think, is there a word plurality, or what's the word they use? Yeah, same words can assume so many different forms. I'll see if I can find that reference. But there's something, the plurality has a different political meaning also. Here, plurality, it's saying that, well, in this verse, Krishna is saying you, me, and the kings. So in that sense, it's plural. It's referring to three beings. And it's just fancy way of saying the Mayavadis might say that, okay, the same point, that individual beings, they are different, but only as long as the material life goes on. When spiritual perfection, then that individuality loses. That's the Mayavadi idea. So Prabhupada is commenting on that. So what is a counter argument? So Prabhupada is presenting a counter argument. Well, if we are to accept the Mayavadi argument that, okay, Krishna is not talking about the spirit soul, it's talking about the identity of the ego, like you were saying, right? So it's maybe, let's say, he's talking about the the existence of the subtle and the gross body. He's not talking about the existence of the spirit soul. So the subtle and the gross bodies will continue to maintain, or the subtle body will continue to maintain its individuality even when the gross body dies. That could be one interpretation, the Mayavadi interpretation. But when one achieves spiritual perfection, then all spirits merge with each other. But if this argument cannot be true, Srila Prabhupada is saying, because in the previous verse, Krishna already rejected the bodily conception of life, right? How did he reject? What did Krishna say? Those who are learned, they mourn neither for the living nor the dead. So when it says neither for the living nor the dead, he's talking about the body. So Krishna has already rejected the bodily conception of life. Krishna, having rejected the bodily conception of life, why would he in the next verse again talk about individuality at a subtle body level? So he's not. So that's the point Srila Prabhupada is making. So he's saying the Mayavadi argument does not hold true because Krishna has fully rejected the bodily conception of life. So when one achieves spiritual perfection, even the subtle body dies, right? So subtle body and gross body both are bodily conception of life, and Krishna has rejected that. After condemning the bodily conception of living entities, how was it possible for Krishna to place a conventional proposition of the body again? What is the conventional proposition? The convention means, the form that you're talking about doesn't have a form. So what is the conventional understanding of the form? It's the understanding that we have in our colloquial language. The conventional understanding is of the body is not at a spirit level, it's at the material level. So there are many great acharyas like Ramanuja and others, they have confirmed this. And it is clearly mentioned in Bhagavad Gita that spiritual identity is understood by only the devotees of the Lord. Krishna says later in Bhagavad Gita, Bhaktyam mam abhijananti. So by devotion one can understand. The non-devotee's approach to teachings of Bhagavad Gita is like a bee licking the bottle of honey from outside. So there is a similar saying in English, you say navigating from the shore, right? So we can stand on the shore and we can talk about all the, this is how you navigate a ship, and you can describe in much more detail, but it's not same as going out in the water. You don't have any experience, or what we call what's the term they call armchair philosophers. right? Or people get passionate about a lot of things, especially politics and sports, and we can sit on the comfort of our couch and we can comment, hey, this sportsman should have played like this. Well, we did not play it properly, should have kicked the ball in this way, or this is how they, but we are not out there, they are playing, right? So it's easy to sit and comment. Well, that's one way of thinking, but we don't have direct experience of it. Similarly, bee, if it's just trying to lick the honey from outside, or anyone trying to lick a bottle of honey, you cannot get the taste of it. So similarly, the Bhagavad Gita is studied by Gyanis, and the yogis, they all study it, and they might get, they feel like they are experiencing Bhagavad Gita, but they don't experience it. The real essence of Bhagavad Gita can be experienced only by devotees, and this is confirmed by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. He says, Bhaktyam mam abhijananti. It can be known and understood only by the devotees. Okay. So in that sense, Bhagavad Gita is mystic. But when one becomes a devotee, one can understand it. No one else can taste it. This is stated in the 4th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna, I think, tells Arjuna that, yeah, Bhaktyam mam abhi, that is in 18th chapter. But then in the 4th chapter, Krishna says that, hey, Arjuna, I'm sharing this knowledge with you because you are my devotee and friend. So that's the qualification to be able to appreciate and understand. Nor can Gita be touched by persons who envy the existence of the Lord. So if we say that, well, Krishna also loses his existence on spiritual perfect, well, he is not perfect, but he achieved perfection. We can also achieve perfection. So that is an envious attitude to the Lord. Gita is most misleading. The Mayavadi explanation is the most misleading presentation of the whole truth. Therefore, Lord Chaitanya has forbidden us to read commentations written by such impersonalists like Mayavadis. And one who takes to such an understanding of Mayavad philosophy loses all the power to understand the real mystery of Gita. So Mayavad literally means, Vad means a kind of proposition or worldview. Well, Vad literally means to speak, but you are speaking based on a particular worldview. What is a worldview? That, well, everything is Maya, everything is illusion, everything including the form of the Lord is also illusion. When the Lord comes on this earth, he assumes a form that is a product of illusion. That's not the real form. So then the philosophy which is expanded based on that understanding of false understanding is Mayavad philosophy. That's what it means, Mayavad. The other idea is in the impersonal theory is that we talked about it, like soul actually merges into the effulgence, which is also another way of saying is empirical universe. It's people say, well, all the ultimate truth is that this universe exists. That's all we know, and it's just nature. And so if individuality refers to the empirical universe, sometimes people ask, who are you? Well, they have some idea that I'm spirit, but then the ultimate spirit or is the universe, what it exists. So then they identify themselves with the nature in the form of universe. So if individuality refers to the empirical universe, then there is no need for teaching by the Lord. That's the point Srila Prabhupada is making. In that case, we can, just like if we see like a lot of aborigines, they are really nature worshippers, and they don't need to be taught about it. They live in nature, and they respect the nature, they worship the nature, and for them that is the universe, right? It's empirical. Empirical means something that they can feel, touch, taste, they can perceive. And if that is what our identity is, in that sense, if we think that is our absolute truth, then there is no need of teaching by the Lord or by anyone, right? So there's no need for Bhagavad Gita at that point in time. Like I think it was a couple of years ago, a Christian preacher tried to go to Andaman Nicobar Islands, and he wanted to bring Christianity to the Aborigines, and some of the islands over there, there are Aborigines who have never come in contact with, the outside world. I think they call them the sentinels. So anytime somebody tries to make contact, they shower, spears and arrows. And so this Christian preacher died while trying to, bring Christianity to them, and they don't even speak the same language. And so they are nature worshippers. And there was an Indian archaeologist, I think it was an article recently only, this lady from Tamil Nadu, she was the only person who was successfully able to establish a peaceful contact with the sentinels. She did that once and she gave up, like, let's not bother these people. And I think what she did, she went in a boat close by, and earlier they used to just drop like a sacks full of, like a bag full of coconuts. But she didn't do that. She just took one coconut out and she rolled it in the water towards them. And so, they were happy to receive the coconut, and, they sort of welcomed her. And, this was the only time probably somebody had a peaceful contact. And then she realized, why bother these people? So anyway, recently, I think 2 days ago, there was an article where she commented that, well, they are nature worshippers. They are Aborigines. They don't need any religion, so they say, so just leave them alone. So, in this context, we can say that, well, if the understanding of any individuals or group of individuals is that, where their religion is just nature, right? If they identify and relate to the empirical universe, again, which is energy of Krishna, but if that's how they can directly experience it, they don't need anyone to teach any if that is the absolute truth, then there's no need for anything teaching beyond that. So Srila Prabhupada is making the point. So plurality of the individual soul and the Lord is eternal fact, and this is confirmed in the Vedas. So I think we are about time now. I think we'll stop over here. I know some of you have a hard stop. You can continue from 13th verse next time. If anyone has any questions or comments, it's a good time to ask. Those who need to leave, that's all right. You can listen to the recording of the Q&As if you like. Anyone has any questions or comments?
So as a person that I don't know which one is true or not at this moment, like the Mayavadi or what Srila Prabhupada is saying, but I'm seeing it as an idealistic perspective. I don't have any preference at this moment, but how can we comment that the Mayavadis could not understand? I mean, especially the example that you provided about the bees cannot lick the honey inside the bud. So how do we know they know it or not?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of a person. Generally, I don't take sides. So I just wanted to be idealistic and realized.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that
so
we are.
That's the reason I don't take.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's not that we have anything against any particular, there's no enmity as such, but the idea a lot of time that we see is that, well, we should not speak anything, we should not make any discrimination of any sort, right? That kind of idea or ethos exists. But if you see, discrimination always exists, in the sense, I'll give you an example. Like if you go to any company or any country, all businesses have rights to start all entrepreneurs have right to start their own business, and they can publicly list your company. And as you follow all the rules and regulations, and you all get equal treatment, you're all subject to equal law. So there's equality in that sense. But then the Securities and Exchange Commission does make distinction. Well, this is a AAA plus bond. This is AA. This is single A. This is B plus B minus, right? And then you cannot say that, well, this is well, if you don't understand the logic by which by those gradings are done, then you might say, well, this is a discrimination, like all businesses are equal. Yeah, I mean, they are equal in a way that they have the right to run the business, and they have the subject to the same rules and laws, and subject to the competitive environment, but then there is the fundamental financials of those companies are different, and then there are gradings. So if you understand the logic, then you can appreciate. So the logic is that, well, there is negation, then there is neutrality, which is 0, and there is a positive range of numbers. So, and all of them are true. It's not that the idea that you merge into the absolute truth. It's not a false understanding, but that is neutrality, right? A soul, the Brahman is there. It's a fact, and one can achieve Brahman perfection. Meaning, what happens is those who meditate on Brahman, at the end of the life, those yogis, they go and their soul merges as one of the particles in that light emerging out from the spiritual planets. So that's not a false understanding. It's a correct understanding. But that is neutrality. What it means is that in this material world, we have bitter experiences with people. And so you can consider it as a negative range of numbers. So one way of immediate gratification is, even if you go to heavenly planets, you still have to deal with people. So the yogis say, well, we have to get out of this. That means I don't want any kind of dealings in material body with anyone. So then, you know, the immediate escape is, well, you lose your individuality in one sense, in the sense that you don't have any gross body by which you can have social interactions with others, right? So that is going from negative ranges to 0. And that's what it means. So now when he merges with the light, it's not that, it's just like the sunlight. You think it looks that sunlight is homogeneous, but sunlight comprises of photons. And each photon is an individual particle. So when a soul merges into the Brahman, the soul does not lose its identity. It appears like it, right? Because just like a light, light just looks homogeneous. So from our perspective, it's like just homogeneous light, but then light actually has individual particles of photons. So here, the Vaishnava philosophy is not saying that it is completely incorrect. No, one can achieve impersonal perfection, but it's not that impersonal liberation. It's not that one cannot achieve impersonal liberation. But what they consider impersonal is not really impersonal. The spirit soul still has its own identity. Now, so that is the distinction that it's making. It appears that the soul has lost its identity. In one sense, you can say it has lost because there is no social interaction. There may be other particles of soul who are in that Brahman effulgence, but they're not interacting with each other. They are just, it's like, I'm tired with a extremely hard, difficult day at work, and I come down and I just want no one. Just leave me alone. I want to just relax on my couch, nothing. So nothingness is very blissful, right? But you cannot be in that nothingness and of doing nothing for a long period of time. Once you are refreshed and you're like, okay, now I want to play with my child, I want to interact with my family members, and that is the positive experience that will really make me happy. If you say that, well, I'll just sit on the couch for a long time, just do nothing, you'll get bored after some time. So actually, scriptures describe that the souls who do merge into the Brahman, they might remain there for relatively much longer period of time according to our lifespans, but eventually they will get bored. And unless they find their real spiritual identity in a spiritual body, and they achieve a spiritual planet, any of the Vaikuntha planets, and they engage in their natural relationships as a friend, as a servant, as a parent, as in a conjugal lover, which is the positive spectrum of the number line, right? So you talked about negation, then neutrality, but then the real thing that one has to experience is, well, once you are, okay, you're tired from work and you sat for some time, but that's not gonna give you ultimate happiness unless you start enjoying. Maybe you had tough time with your colleagues, but you want to enjoy now with your child or your one's wife or parents, and you want to socially interact with your friends. So same thing applies to spiritual life also. So that's and the point, that particular comment of licking the bottle of honey from outside is specifically saying is that Gita is offering that entire spectrum. It's offering the entire positive spectrum of the number line. But the yogis or the impersonalists, they are, if they don't cultivate the devotional attitude, they don't experience that positive spectrum. They might experience neutrality, and so they they might hear, oh, there is an idea of bhakti that is mentioned, but they have not experienced it. And because they have not experienced it, they, just like a honeybee who sees, well, there is honey inside, but maybe there is something, but then there is leaking the bottle of honey, and they think, oh, this is nice, right? But then that's the idea that we are saying. So it's nothing. The Vaishnava philosophy encompasses all philosophies. So it's not in, it's not in contradiction, but it adds to it. It goes beyond it and provides the ultimate value. The conflict, apparent conflict, actually conflict happens when one has an incorrect understanding of the impersonal liberation also. So there is a difference between Brahmavad and Mayavad. Okay, maybe this will help you. So Brahmavad and Mayavad are very similar. Brahmavad, the Vaishnava philosophy has no conflict, because Brahmavad is the idea that soul does not lose its existence but can merge into Brahman. That is Brahmavad. The Mayavad philosophy does not have that understanding. What it says that soul loses its existence, or Krishna does not have a form. He comes over here as a material form, right? So we are not against the Brahmavad philosophy, which we accept impersonal liberation. We already talked about the absolute truth has three forms: Swayam Bhagavan, Paramatma, and Brahman. There is nothing against Brahman, but the idea of spiritual suicide, that the spiritual perfection is actually what tantamounts to spiritual suicide, where one loses the existence. That is the primary distinction between Mayavad and Brahmavad, and that is not accepted. That's it's not a philosophically sound or the conclusion of the Vedas. That is the only distinction. Otherwise, there is no. So there is a subtle difference between Mayavad and Brahmavad, and it might the subtle difference is the one accepts the individuality, the other one does not accept the individuality. So Brahmavad is also on the platform of neutrality. Brahmavad is not experiencing the positive range, and that is fine. But this is like saying that as soon as you arrive at 0, the pointer ceases to exist, right? Like the observer ceases to exist. It's like, you lose our individuality. That is, tantamount to spiritual suicide. There's no basis for it. That's the only difference. Otherwise, there's no difference.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I also kind of agree with one way, like for example, if you read some of the Bhagavatam stories, like where in case of Narada, Narada in his previous life, he actually get the picture of Narayana at a glimpse, and
Yes.
he get a message saying that you have to leave this body and you have to again wait for the kalpa to complete. Then only you will actually come to me. So it's like when Brahma day is complete, he again actually go back into the. I'm probably not using the right words here because I'm not expert
No,
in
you're
these
right.
words.
Yeah, Kalpa is Brahma's day.
Yeah, right. And so then he'll again born as a Brahmaputra, like son of Brahma. Then he actually got more access to Narayana. So that way, if you see, he actually merged with Brahma in the night, and in the morning he actually again take a form, but probably this time in the spiritual world. That probably one of the analogy that I could think of whenever you explaining.
No, he does. When at the end of the day of Brahma, the souls, they don't go to Brahman, because they are not spiritually perfect. Only those who achieve spiritual perfection, even at an impersonal level, then they go, because Brahman is outside this material universe. What happens is, when the day of Brahma overs, the souls, they actually go enter the body of Garbhodakshai Vishnu, the Vishnu from whose navel the lotus flower came out. And then they go back into the navel of Vishnu, and they still are existing as individual particles within the navel of Vishnu at the end of the day of Brahma.
Okay. I hope I'll get more more information about it soon. Yeah. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Anyone has any other questions, comments? Okay, if not, we'll continue next time. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.